My guest today is Dmitry. He is the very prolific owner operator of a Substack called The Essence of a Thing and the creator of the DeFi project Salutary. Today we discuss why do people believe in the politics that they believe in? Why do they adhere to the narratives, the political parties that they believe in? We also talk about why Cthulhu swims inexorably left until things really, really start to break down. We also talk about why neoliberalism is probably not going to save you, or if it does save you, it doesn't save you from the things that really matter, and a lot more things, including his concept of biofoundationalism, which I find very interesting. So I think you'll enjoy this conversation. I know I have. If you would like to support this podcast, please do go to alexkashuta.com and become a paid subscriber. It really does help me. You can also go to Patreon if you just want the audio of the podcast. That's patreon.com/aksubversive. Enjoy the conversation. So, the core of your more recent work is to me this concept, this kind of grouping of ideas called biofoundationalism. And I know there's quite a lot to it, and it's quite a wide spectrum of things that's included in this. But maybe you can give me a little bit of a hint. Okay, what are you referring to with biofoundationalism?
Yeah, it does like inform like everything else I kind of assess and analyze because I think it is like a foundational sort of thing to internalize. And the TLDR of it is, um, you know, political traits and characteristics are divided very evenly, typically like across societies. Like the split is pretty consistent. When I see that, I see a natural phenomenon. I see a dyad that is natural, that there's a reason why that exists. It's not like half the society is reading some facts and the other half society sees other facts. Like, well, why are they drawn to those facts, quote unquote? Um, and I then see information on like brain scans and information on being able to triangulate political beliefs off things that are not related to that at all. And the amygdalas and conservatives are larger. Their like right insula is much more sensitive to feelings of disgust and like moral disgust. They're more responsive to puffs of air in their ear, like whereas liberals in the ACC, the anterior cortex, I forget the middle name.
Cingulate.
There's a little, what's that?
Cingulate, I think, or
Yes, there
anterior
you go.
singular
Yeah,
cortex. Yeah.
that's right. Theirs is a little larger, and that has more to do with like some certain nuanced stuff. They have lower threat detection, and like you can see that in the brain activity. Like it's observable. And right now, even without AI, we can predict political beliefs with like 72 to 80% accuracy based off brain scans. You run that through an AI eventually, like we're going to get to like 95, 97. It's going to be disturbing how like three things that have no relation to politics nominally can inform like, oh, this guy's this, like you can archetype them off very little. So I see that and I think, okay, this is temperamental, which is to say it's biological, which is to say, what kind of conversation are we having here? Like, is this a fact based? Is this a cultural based? Oh, we need to like, are you convincing someone with in any like real sense that you understand them to be? So when you see it from that lens, you see like people are calibrated to have moral beliefs, and the moral beliefs are underlying the political beliefs, and the political beliefs express themselves based off environment. So this is where I like to say moral genotypes and then political phenotypes, and the genotype creates the phenotype. And what makes that phenotype become dominant in society, as far as I can observe, is literally the environment, which is prosperity. A well-known statement in that kind of realm is the environment kind of facilitates a phenotype, and I see that and I think, well, the environment facilitates the expression. The environment creates the expression. So the richer you are, the more you see this ascendant liberal viewpoint. Isn't that just a coincidence, right? And then the more hardship and more poor and more difficult things are, conservative moral foundations become ascendant because it's a utility function as far as I'm concerned. They have more utility in hard environments. You can't have fluffy, rational based, like kind of like creative stuff in hardship. You need to double down and get empiric. You need to like focus on what matters. Empiric and conservatism is ascendant there. As you get more comfort and prosperity, liberalism, luxury conditions start to beget these luxury beliefs. And that's why it's like you can't have a backdrop of prosperity and have conservative ideals be ascendant. I think it's like I wrote in one of my essays, it's like trying to grow sunflowers in the winter. It's just not an environment conducive to it. So I'll stop there. I know I said a short answer. I hope that was at least clear. That's kind of the underpinning of it all. It's a moral genotype creating a political phenotype, and the utility of the beliefs is a product of the expression of the environment.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of an indictment in a way of people in this sphere and people who are kind of political pundits. And interestingly enough, before I was reading your stuff, I had started to kind of notice this pattern in me because I'm someone who's been libertarian, and obviously I've moved more to the right. Now I'm kind of sliding more back to the center, maybe because but it's always very interesting to me to notice kind of how my thinking on a certain issue arises and how I scan for patterns that fit whatever moral predisposition or moral preconception I've already kind of cooked up in my head. And I see it obviously much better in other people who been
Right.
flip-flopping around and obviously it's easier to condemn than them, but now I see it in myself and it's like, okay, I know this is happening. Is there any way to step outside of it and be more logical? And I find that it's kind of it's quite a hard challenge because I know it's happening, but I also can't really stop this train.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
interesting.
And I don't think it's necessarily anything to be stopped. Like I don't think it's to frame it as like selfish or like not self-aware that you're doing that. I don't think is right. Like when I hear political stances, I hear people lobbying for environments most conducive to them prospering. And, unsurprisingly, what do libertarian guys want and vote for? They're high conscientious, they're very industrious, they're the kind of guy who are entrepreneurs. Unsurprisingly, what environments do they like? Oh, wow, the lowest touch, least government interference, most free market, most capitalistic kind of Darwinian landscape, because that's an environment where they ascend. That's where they excel. The Starbucks barista, what does he lobby for? Unsurprising. Like you're just voting your temperament. You're just voting for environments conducive to your skill sets and you don't know it. You post hoc rationalized this kind of factual based reasoning based off of books you've read that again just give you the fodder to again post hoc justify what you wanted to believe anyway. There are a lot of books out there like why'd you pick those books, like why'd you pick those facts. You've curated a very unique set of facts to formulate a narrative on the best way to things ought to be, and I doubt that doesn't actually comport well with what your strength and skill set is. Unsurprisingly, I bet that's probably pretty close. And so you're always voting your temperament. And I see this that's when I see like discussions on their nominal terms. It's just kind of uninteresting because I'm just like, well, yeah, of course you vote for that. Why wouldn't you vote for that? That's your best environment, right? So yeah, that's kind of like the underpinning of that too. And then once you can internalize that, like I write about too, and that you notice like a verbal understanding and an embodied understanding, like we can verbally say, oh yeah, okay, you can predict political beliefs off this. That's cool. All right. In today's news, it's like, well, it's not a moving on thing. It's like that should change structurally how you navigate governance and political discourse in a very real way. I feel if that's like internalizing it in an embodied way. And then you govern accordingly based off that, but understanding that people will always, tribes of people like racial groups, even gender groups, like women lobby for their self-interest. Like, no shit, of course they do. They want things more conducive to them, and men should do that too. It's finding a dyad and a balance that keeps that relative, healthy, antagonistic, synergistic equilibrium that creates, typically speaking, the best environment. As tried as it is, like balance is usually good. When you have an overwhelming, patriarchal male-led force, that typically means times are hard. Conservative values are ascendant. Maybe you're at war, maybe you're poor, maybe you're gaining resources and getting rich. And then as you get that, you see more feminine moral foundations become ascendant. Distribution, getting more things to more people. Now we care about higher tax rates and like funding other things. Like you have luxury things you can start to occupy yourself with. And surprisingly, the nation starts to care about that. And then you see just people more and more lobbying for their temperament.
Yeah, there's this kind of anecdote, or the so-called sailor's law of female journalism, which is kind of this in a nutshell. But the idea that it only applies to female journalists, in time, kind of struck me as very funny because the
Yeah.
idea in sailor's law is that female journalism is a lot of it is women writing articles that come the revolution they would be higher in the sexual pecking order. People would like their
Yeah.
frizzy hair or would think that different body shapes are acceptable, or beauty standards, things like that.
Right.
But
Right.
if you look at most blog posts from across the spectrum, from libertarian to traditionalist to everything, and you dig a little bit into the biography of the author, you can definitely detect a law of introduced X grouping that you're part of, because yeah, it's just I guess human nature, and I think
Yeah,
you
yeah. You would expect. I mean, especially women and where their sexual market value comes from, and where their a lot of like their self worth, so to speak, comes from is being attractive, like being sought after, being coveted, being admired, cherished. Obviously, they'd lobby for that. Like, I mean, that to me, that's like such a. It's true. Like his observation's true, but to me, it's also like, would you expect anything different? Like, would you like? I would fully believe that when you have an environment where you can have that kind of commentary because things are comfortable and decadent and you can write like that, you'd expect like people to more be like, hey, how about me? How about my turn? Like I want to be ascended in some way. And that's how they do it. They just don't do it in an explicit way because I don't think anyone internalizes what they're really doing. They're acting it out, but they don't like aware that they're acting out things for their own self-interest that are temperamental impetuses, not like some, where you went to school.
Yeah, I think especially on the right wing, but probably on the left wing as well. I'm just more familiar with the right. There's kind of this maybe a little bit self-congratulatory idea that we are the principled side. We have these principles; they're unwavering. We hold them despite the dark truths that they encode, and we look reality straight in the face and we hold on to these principles. But you're on this side for a particular reason. You have a
Yeah.
certain status that you're not necessarily very happy with. You could be in a different status hierarchy. If you're on the other side and maybe successful within it, there's quite a lot of that as well. But yeah, I mean, it's always like I said. When I was doing a bit of introspection on this, it's very hard to see exactly where this ends when when you start to think about it very closely.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
And those principles too, like where'd you get those from? Like the founding father principle, like what was the selection effects for those guys and the Europeans that came over and did that? High disagreeableness, super high certain traits along the lines of like, authority subversion, but like in the rejection of that, like a very libertarian sort of categorization. And the principles are unsurprisingly very libertarian. And those libertarian principles have had a high valence for like the entrepreneurial industrial types that are very good at building and amassing wealth. And it's like this is where it's like the right form of governance and setup needs to come. And you need to understand that like the Pareto distribution will always be there. And certain people will be hyper productive for you, and certain people will just simply not. But a productive class though allows the consumption and existence of the high production. Like there's a symbiotic element to it. They're not just like bottom feeder parasites. So it's like you need to enable that, hide that 20%. Don't ever eschew them, because if you do, you've signed your death warrant on wealth creation, and now you're just kind of slowly draining what you built. So it's like calibrating to like understand the makeup of a society, like biologically, from high agency, low agency, and then certain temperamental stuff, and creating it in a way that understands that, rather than like some sort of principled stance, which principles are good, but they're like fundamentally expressions of moral beliefs, and like really getting to the crux of where those moral beliefs come from, and the temperamental kind of inclinations you have, and enabling some and helping others, and trying to create balance, I suppose.
Yeah, the sad and a way interesting bit is that you can have relatively stable societies at different gradations of enslavement of the productive class. We had quite half a century of relatively stable communism. Where I'm from, and it was relatively functional, even though there were productive people and they were definitely exploited to the max and in the ways that they could be within the system.
Hmm.
But they were essentially kind of semi enslaved by the rest of the population, and it just wasn't. It was stable as an equilibrium, and my question is, I don't, how far can it go in the West? Do you think it's a bit more? Is the equilibrium a little bit more sensitive in the West, or where do you see that going?
I think, where is that equilibrium? I don't claim to know that, but if I had to like pinpoint an era that seemed pretty good in hindsight, like 1960s America seemed to kind of roughly be landing that just before the Civil Rights Act stuff, like where it was meritocratic, the certain like overt racialism or discrimination was starting to die down. I mean, relatively so. Again, nothing's perfect, but like that sounds roughly like a good spot. Um, yeah, that's hard. Like I can say, like once you get too prosperous and too comfortable, then you get like these luxury beliefs creeping in, and it's counterproductive. To me, that's like embedded entropy in these systems. Like I see them as complex adaptive systems the same way I see a star. Like I just don't think there's a difference. Like these are just organizations of people doing what they do in a kind of a pre-programmed way because it's biologically instantiated at what, or instilled at what we do. And that once you get to when the environment shifts to a certain amount, the friction abates and you get entropy. And we're seeing that now with certain like issuing certain order-based rules of law, certain things that give the bulwark of structure, like we're caring about them less. When can you care about those less? When you're comfortable and when there's no threat behind the corner. Like when there's no threat behind the corner, you don't have to turn around. And that's kind of what we're in now. So yeah, maybe 50, 60s America sounds about right. But yeah, it's when things are too comfortable is when you typically have a problem, because people, when they have no problems, they tend to just create them. There's a great quote, and I'm gonna like butcher it slightly, but it's approximately correct, that man will never find the utopia because if he did, he'd destroy it in a day out of boredom.
Yeah.
Like
The
if you found that, it would
1970s.
just, yeah, it'd be bored. You'd be bored. Like, this is too comfortable. Fuck it. We got to cause some problems, makes up some fake problems and then attack those. And it kind of sows the seeds of your own demise. Like, victory defeats you effectively when you're too comfortable in it.
Yeah, well, you definitely see that on an individual level. A lot of people who, feel like they're treading water. People in the lower classes and middle classes, even, slightly upper class people who just, don't seem to find meaning. Because I think a lot of people, there's a lot of chatter about the crisis of meaning. How can people find meaning? Like, I really don't think, meaning as this, hobby/surrogate activity that you have to invent for yourself. It's a bit hollow if you don't have some sort of survival impulse behind it, or some sort of, status as survival. Because now you can play status games, as a surrogate activity, as fun.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't, it doesn't hit the same way as it was, where, if you weren't high status, you were at higher risk of dying. Your family, your kin, people in your alliances and things like that. Things just there was so much more at stake. Historically, for the longest time, and now very little is at stake. Especially if you consider, I know, poverty has not been eradicated, but even people who lose their job tomorrow, their risk of dying of hunger and exposure is very, very low. So once you take that,
welfare, exactly. Yeah.
Take that off the table, and even in outside of the West, outside even of Eastern Europe, outside of even most countries in the world, that's still not the case. And yeah, I think it's a bit, and this obviously ties into children as well, because that's kind of one of the big crises on the table, that people have stopped having children. But as a mother of two kids myself, and someone who's really been plugged into all these kind of trad spaces and all of this stuff, it's hard to not see it as a bit of a fancy hobby at some point. You can, if you're very religious and really take religion seriously, I can see how that might not be the case. But I am a bit of a cafeteria Catholic, so for me, it's definitely very much a hobby. So it's it's I see people who just don't have the time or the disposable income. Those are the people who don't opt to have children, because it's like, I can't take on another expensive hobby. I have enough of those. So this is really expensive. I just can't do it. So yeah, it's it is really tough, and I don't really see that going back. I mean, what's your take on the fertility crisis?
I mean, again, I kind of view it like a utility function. Like if you see the decline of a lot of the birth rates, I don't think it's a feminism thing so much. Like in some place, I think that's a convenient girl boss kind of explanation for it. But you also see it in South Korea. You see it in Japan. Like they don't have that problem. In fact, culturally, they're pretty good there. People had a lot of kids back in the day because infant mortality was high and you needed hands to help and build things. Like from a technological standpoint, like you needed more people to accomplish and grow and proliferate. So it's like, again, viewing these things as complex adaptive systems that are trying to propagate themselves in a way, you need less humans to do what you needed to accomplish before. And that sounds very unpleasant to say, because I don't think it's healthy to view humans that way. But nonetheless, I look at the behaviors and I'm like trying to explain, like, why is this occurring? I think that's why. I think fundamentally technology has like removed the need for as much hands as we used to have. People don't die as often, they live longer. And you're sort of seeing that borne out in this. And, people who extrapolate down to like extinction, that's also silly. Like, no, it's just correcting a number based off of like our environment that you're sort of seeing an embodied understanding from people, despite what they may verbally say, where it's like, well, if you can do comfortable things and get away with it, people typically do, just as an axiom of life. Like, you only do the tough things because you have to. We're only going to stop deficit spending because we can't deficit spend anymore. Not because some principled people like, hey, have you guys seen the deficit? It's bigger today. No one cares. No one cares. They don't even talk about them more when they're campaigning. Which, frankly, it's kind of a red herring on its face. It does matter, but not in the way that it's presented as. But like, you're not going to see those numbers go down until there's discomfort, until you cannot do it anymore because pretty much inflation says no. And I also see that's at the national level, then at the societal micro level. You're also seeing it with like families and kids. It's a tough thing to do. It's a low time preference, a noble thing to work towards. And most people aren't low time preference, high agency types unless they have to, unless nature says, sorry, like, you got to do this. And I think you're sort of seeing that in everyone's embodied behavior. I don't think it's a cultural thing. I think it's a comfort, technological, environment, not in like the global warming stuff, environmental, and like the underpinnings of the environment, creating this expression of, you just don't need as many kids.
Yeah, and that's why you see this pretty pronounced U-shaped curve, because you have people obviously who are still very impulsive at the bottom of the type preference thing, where they skip over even basic contraception and just happen to have children, and then you have a big bottoming out in the middle, and then it picks back up where people start earning more, and then having time and money for these expensive hobbies called children, because there's also this extremely, if you're a parent and if you're interested in parenting and all of this stuff, I'm now in a course of learning how to deal with my toddler in a gentle way and all this type of stuff. So I'm one of those parents that's kind of plugged into the parenting industrial complex. It's a huge cognitive burden. There's so much knowledge. There's so many nuances, I could go medieval on him, but I don't have the heart. So I have to, pay into the system. But it's a time demand, it's a financial demand. I
So
have to be
touch on that
present.
really quick, because I don't want to
Sure.
forget this point, because for you saying that, it's funny. Millennials tend to manifest in two ways, which I'm assuming you're a millennial.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So they tend to manifest in like two ways. One, we're aware of the boomer self-interest and like, just, I need to touch on that. I think it's kind of, we're just aware of that. They're very self-interested, kind of selfish, self-centered people. And the millennials tend to manifest in two ways. One, like Disney adults, where they're also very self-interested. They don't have kids. They just want to hedonistically do their thing, which is just a derivation of their boomerist type parents in a way. And then, or they're like you, where they're the total opposite. They're way more focused on the kid than the boomers probably were. They're like, okay, now I'm going to really love this kid and like really make sure I do right by him. So it's like this poetic like divergence with millennials, where it's like Disney adult, or I'm going to do super right by him and never make these mistakes again kind of thing. It's just interesting to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah, I think it's, the A-type people tend to be, they try to be very conscientious about child raising as well. But I think the Disney adults are scared off of it by seeing what it actually takes. The like waking up at 4 a.m, it's screaming, they're screaming, there are teeth, there's, doctor's visits, taking it's it's a nonstop commitment if you buy into this model of parenting. The problem is it's hard to opt out if you want to be part of any sort of middle class to upper class social circle. This is what people are doing. This is the most expensive, most complicated hobby that everyone's playing. It's not pickleball. It's very, very hard. And if you don't play it according to the rules, you will be judged and ostracized and all of this type of stuff. So you pay into the expensive kindergartens, you do the whatever cognitive development
It's like a
that you need
signaling
to do.
thing.
It is, and obviously we take shortcuts. I'm not completely obsessed with parenting, but it really does feel pretty hard to opt out of it, even if you're trying to be very rational about it and very kind of free range. There's no one else on the range. It's just you can't really be very free range if you can't let your kid go outside and play, I don't know, in the dirt like we used to when I was growing up, especially because I grew up here in Romania. It was very chill. No one cared about us. But yeah, I think that's the biggest, chunk of childhood that's missing, and it's what's missing for parents as well. Like, the amount of sacrifice that's expected of you as a parent is immense. And
Where do you feel where do you feel that expectation emanating from though? Because like no one's explicitly imposing that on you. It's almost self-imposed, right? Like where do you feel that originates from for you?
hmm, yeah, I think it is in a way self-imposed because, what happens in my universe with my child is one thing. I think I've also been a little bit infected by, the millennial therapy culture and all this type of
Hmm.
stuff, and parent-child dynamics and things like that, and things that didn't go well with my parents. I'm trying not to, whatever, continue the cycle
Yeah,
and try to be a good mother. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's also the lack of alternatives. Like, I can't. My kids are also very small. I can't really put them on the street. Even if it was like 50 years ago, they would be pretty small to be, left out with other children on the
yeah.
street. But even when they're going to be of that age, it's just not customary anymore. It's just I feel like there was one day, one year where the the streets emptied of children and everyone moved inside, and every family became this kind of self-contained unit. And
Yeah.
you just have to figure it out. And I think it's also like I just
Atomized, yeah.
yeah, atomized, and it's two adults and we have two small children in one house all the time, and we get on each other's nerves, and we have to figure out ways to deal with each other without making it worse. So I think that's the problem. There's just no one else to delegate it to. I think Romania is
Yeah.
a good place generally because people's grandparents are very involved, but I don't have any more family, so
Yeah.
it is what it is. It's just us. So now it's us and the internet and Google telling us
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
to do to relate to these kids.
I was in Bucharest last year, or I'm sorry, this year, like 7 months ago for about like 6 weeks, I think. So first time in Romania.
Did you like it?
I did. I did. It was like very stark. Like there was like a nice downtown
It
area,
is, yeah.
and then there was
Mhm.
like parts there where I'm like, oh, this is uglier than the U.S. Like, what's going on here?
Oh,
Um, I know that's really saying something, but like it had its European parts too, and so I was like, this is in the cost of living. Like the cost of stuff was atoned for any sins it may have had on the structural standpoint. I was really I enjoyed it. I really did like
yeah.
it,
You
and I
should you
had
should
like
come
the
to where I live. The cost of living is even cheaper and it's much nicer. The nice part of town is about half of town, so there's not the outskirts are much smaller. But yeah, I live
gotcha.
in Transylvania, so I just got to insert my little Transylvanian promo
Uh,
here to people who want to come to Romania. Don't go to Bucharest. Come to Transylvania. It's nicer. Yeah. So, yeah, talking about kids. I mean, talk about kids all the time in this podcast. But people are probably a bit tired of it. But I think you mentioned this before, but I think it's a really interesting thing to go into. And you give the example of Elon Musk here as
mhm.
someone who has a very deep embodied knowledge of power,
Yeah.
but maybe not the sharpest verbal skills. I think this is people always pick on Elon Musk, because he shares the kind of wacky memes, and maybe he doesn't always express himself in the most sophisticated way, but he is essentially, the Randian being of the future. He's
Yeah.
here. He controls insane amounts of the economy. He's obviously extremely competent. I mean, what
Yeah.
what are people missing? What are the journalists missing about
Yeah.
Elon Musk?
Yeah. People just again they can't. They're so like obsessed with like the nominal and the superficial, and I mean what's presented, and it's not this is what Elon puts out there as like the base thing to find. So it's not like they're looking at something that's not there. But when you do that, it just totally again ignores this structure of behaviors that should tell you everything you need to know. And this is like an essay I wrote like kind of in response to Curtis Yarvin's criticisms of him. We're like, he's botching this, he's doing it wrong, and I'm just like, because Curtis obviously has a very good verbal understanding of power. Like his verbal understanding it's excellent. He and I converge on like a lot of stuff there, but like Elon's embodied understanding of power, I don't think there's anyone that touches that. I mean, one man, historically even, one man controls the most efficient way to get to space, the most valuable transportation company in the world. It just passed $1 trillion, Tesla. The most high impact social media company in the world, the most sophisticated satellite communication company, in the world, the most advanced mind machine company with Neuralink, and God knows what else he controls in AI. He just made like the biggest data center apparently that exists currently. It's like one guy did all those. Those are all disparate. They're all atoms based, like physical things too, which is interesting to me, except Twitter, which he didn't even make. But like all of those things exist in like an atoms tech convergence. He's mostly atoms based, atoms versus bits, meaning atoms, physical world, and bits, digital world. And he like transcends both in a unique way. And I'm like, I want you to imagine like if someone, if Bain existed and he was like, all right, I need to set up a network of power and get this way, but I also need to like do it legally and not have anyone, but I need a nexus of power and control, and I'm not a government. What would that look like? How it would look exactly like what Elon's doing. He has more power than many heads of state, bar none. Like his resource availability, his network, his infrastructure. I mean, this guy absolutely has more power than I would say most heads of state, probably. Much more influence too. And then this infrastructure on top of it, I'm just like, any of you guys criticizing it. It's like such a slop gossip. What did Brad Pitt eat for dinner today? Like superficial degree of like criticism. I'm like, I just, again, it just misses the forest for the trees and just really overlooks this guy's like structural understanding of what power and I don't want to say control because that sounds pejorative. I don't think it's like malicious or anything like that, but like he really does get this at like a cerebral spinal level that we just don't. But when you see it, you should respect it. And I just feel even most people don't respect it like it deserves to be. Like this is like historically speaking, probably the best entrepreneur of all time. And like this constellation of assets he has made on his own. Not only has he made them, he's made them in industries that are just incredibly hard to do, especially two of them. Like the first car IPO since Ford was Tesla. Like no one makes, especially like American cars. Like those are all outsourced to, China now for the manufacturing. Like he pulled that off in electric and like a more higher tier class thing, a higher tier level of car, and then with SpaceX, that was a monopoly beforehand with the ULA, the United Launch Alliance with Boeing and Lockheed Martin, where they had a monopoly on all government contracts for space launches. He literally created SpaceX, then sued them like this is a monopoly, not fair. And he also won on the back of his launches were like I believe 1/10 of the cost than theirs, just unbelievably more cost effective. So it's just like you did that in not one but two industries, like impossible industries that like are never disrupted. It's incredible, and like he deserves like to have his actions understood on those levels, not this like tabloid tier criticism about the meme he posted today. Like he's obviously an incredibly talented guy, and I think he knows that probably gets people's attention away from the real stuff he's doing. That's like, holy shit, like this guy's like a small government. To like hey, look over here, I posted a silly meme that's controversial today. He does that probably on purpose. This guy deserves every benefit of the doubt at this point because it's just like it's incredibly impressive when you just describe it without Elon's name. Like if you're like writing a comic book and I wanted to describe like the guy who's like the Iron Man person or whatever, like he owns this and this and this, he's super rich. Like it sounds fake when you describe it without his name, and then you put his name on it, and it's like, oh well, it's Elon. Who cares? Like we all know Elon. It's like, well, I don't know. I think you should view him in a different context.
Yeah, I think it's when he kind of entered the space of Twitter, and by entered I mean he bought the thing.
Yeah.
I think a lot of journalists and pundits, thought, okay, now he is within our status hierarchy. Which if you're someone in this tier, your whole life is just sparring verbally, and you're like the highest ranked verbal Call of Duty player on the website, and this is what you do all day. You formulate whatever gibberish, and then he comes in, obviously. He's a genius, but he's not the highest ranked verbal Call of Duty tier guy, and he comes in with these mid-tier memes, and he's impressed by things that you already have. I knew about this 5 years ago and things like that, and you feel like you can spout off about him being not the best verbal Call of Duty player.
Exactly.
Obviously he's not, but within the whole status context of the world, he blows you out of the water every time.
Yeah. The verbal thing is true. Like like it's not there as much, and maybe a little bit of it is masking his power levels, but I also just think he's not particularly verbally adroit. And it is what it is. But yeah, like he's like speed running the 4chan meme cycle, and it makes us think like, oh, he's like boomer, whatever. It doesn't quite, it like makes you hold him in a lower tier of, I don't know, like competence, when it's just such a shy. It's just so immaterial to like the real way this guy should be assessed. And even guys like Curtis, when they analyze him, and that was just like, he's not doing it right. Freedom of speech. Your enemy will, if you do this freedom of speech thing, they're just going to use it against you because they'll never afford that ability. Like the criticisms are right on their nominal grounds, but I think Elon knows that phrase sells. I think Elon knows that like it's hard to argue against that on its like nominal terms. It lets him advance ownership of something under something everyone recognizes as being needed. And whether or not he truly believes it, he's kind of temperamentally pretty liberal. He's even admitted that. And he was that before, like, things got way out of whack to the left. Now Elon's right wing. He's really not. Like, he's just more so a pragmatic expression of like reasonable rightism right now, with like this flamboyant flair that gets tabloid and headlines, but it really detracts from like overall what he's doing behind the curtain, which I don't know what his end game is. I don't think he wants to be president. I think that's a waste of his time. But like his position now as like a nice, he's in the administration without being in it. He can exert some play. I think he like played that pretty masterfully. And he probably got pretty blackpilled, like when he saw Brazil going after Starlink for a Twitter violation. It's like, what? Like, just because I own both of them, it's just like complete dereliction of any semblance of law. So he's like, fuck it. I know what I need to do now to win. I need to do this to win. And that's what I'm going to do. So I think he's just pure utility and navigates the world that way.
How do you think this whole Department of Government Efficiency thing will play out? Are the levers there? Is there any way of actually making things efficient? Because I mean, most of the bloat in government is not necessarily within the agencies; it's welfare.
Yeah, I know. So on two levels, no, I don't think it will do very much. The first level is, one, the executive office just, and again, Curtis calls it administrative branch, which I agree with. Like, the presidency is better understood as like an administrative branch. You can't fire them. Like, there's a Supreme Court ruling called Humphrey's Executive versus the United States that like explicitly codified that. The president can't just clean house on these agencies. He can't just get rid of, the Department of Education staff or something. So it's like he's very neutered structurally. Like, you would, if you wanted to do stuff like this, you'd need like a real approach that like says, okay, step one, we have to like get this repealed by SCOTUS. SCOTUS would have to repeal Humphrey's executive fees to the U.S. and whatever else mitigates his ability to act there. And then you can install Elon. And then you can install your own people at the DOJ too, frankly, which you need to do. Like, that's the main tool and weapon on more, diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff. But on like the cutting government program stuff, like, you need to repeal that, then Elon can do his thing. But without that, I don't know what you're doing. I don't know how you do it unless you just subvert the law and no one does anything to you, which you don't own the DOJ, and they probably will do something to you. So they don't like you unless you clean house and put your people in there, which are not there unless you repeal that statute. So like, one, you'd have to do that. And then two, even if you did do that, like you mentioned just now, most of the spending is entitlements. Health insurance is like a quarter of it, of the budget. Social Security is like 21%. Defense is like 13 or 14. And then like welfare and like veterans benefits are like 15-ish% combined. So like, most of that is like stuff you can't cut. You can't cut. You want to know why you can't cut it? You will not get elected. You might even like get impeached if you cut it too much. This is part of like where I say, like, the Cthulhu swims left in prosperous societies. It's not some kind of like insidious, the left is gaining ground thing. It's a utility function. It's how you win in democracies as you become prosperous. You campaign on redistribution, because if it's a democracy and it's a simple majority, roughly speaking, that's how you get more votes. There's again, the Pareto distribution. The industrious types are only 20%. You can't win with just them, even if you got all of them. So it's like you incrementally begin winning by expanding the machine as a redistribution mechanism for the wealth you've created. Because if you don't do it, the other guy's going to. This guy's, what is he, campaigning on bootstraps? Welfare, more for you, some kind of tax, some kind of benefit, some kind of entitlement. Like, people like that. The low agency love that. The low agency are by far the majority of your population. What are you going to sell them on like libertarian ideals? They don't want that. That is not an environment conducive to them ascending or excelling. The environment conducive to them is an environment of handouts and comfort and welfare. You win them by giving that. And you see the US budget over time, and you get people listening to this can read my essay, Gain Dependence, Gain Power, which shows, again, the structural spending over time. I have like one chart right here roughly that like the spending on a GDP basis is like crept up from all Western countries from roughly like, it used to be sub 10% spending as a percentage of GDP. So it's not, it's adjusted for like inflation and all that. It's not just nominal numbers. From like the early 1800s, we'll say, to like now in all the Western nations, it's anywhere from low 40s to 60%. And this is US, Sweden, UK, Italy, France, all of them. All of them got richer. All of them started spending more. Like, it's just like, that's just how it goes. Like, you're not going to, if these are democracies, which they mostly are in terms of the election kind of elements, that's how you win. And then you get this budget increase and these people who are very accustomed to handouts, and like, you cannot campaign on repealing that. Again, that's like growing sunflowers in the winter. You are going to campaign and try to win a democratic election by telling the majority of the population, I'm going to take away what we're giving you. You will never win that way. So it's like this structural element to it, like, is only fixed with changing who's allowed to vote. That's the only way you can really change this, or change the democratic setup of it. But yeah, like back to your core question. Yeah, you can't do much. You really just can't do much. One, on a legal standpoint, you can't do much, and then on a functional, pragmatic standpoint, you also can't do much. You'll never get elected again.
Yeah. In this context, you had a really good example about, all the hand wringing you see from economists, and that's also what I've studied, economics. And when I see all this type of, discussion, even now on tariffs and all this stuff, there are some good arguments to be made about tariffs, but generally, as an economist, you kind of have full body cringe when you hear some of these arguments. And then obviously you have price controls, you have rent fixing, and all these type of stuff. It's as an economist, you can say very clearly that this stuff doesn't work. But as a politician,
what do you mean by work, though, right?
Yeah, exactly. Who does it work for? I think that's a very, very good point. Politically, it works a lot because the people you're talking to aren't economists. It's not the economy that you're talking to, because all of this stuff has extremely long times of actually showing results or deficits or anything. It's not going to happen within 4 years.
The attribution is far too vague. You cannot attribute the failure to explicitly one thing, and that's what makes it so convenient. And yeah, exactly. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's all. You go. I just kind of wanted to bring that up because I thought it was a really good point, and it really drives it home that what people are actually talking about when it comes to debates and all of this stuff is not the truth value of whatever economic proposition and facts. And people really love facts and principles and all of these kind of like pie in the sky things. It's what adds or detracts from the narrative that's going to be convincing to the people of the moral foundations that they hold, and then that's it's really it's a really good example.
So like to touch on that point, which is from Gain Dependence, Gain Power. It's like people analyze these policies on their nominal grounds of like, well, wait, this doesn't work. And it's like, what do you mean by work? Like, it doesn't keep the prices low? It's like, well, that's not what working means here. That's not why they're lobbying that. Like, it's kind of like painfully naive in its own way. It just kind of shows like the degree of analysis here doesn't internalize like the biofoundationalism statements I've made. I feel fundamentally like they'll say people might say they understand it. They'll look at the studies and like, all right, fine. And they'll discuss working on like, does it lower prices? What it does is it is a signaling mechanism. It's a way to sell a moral foundation of care harm or fairness cheating, however you want to phrase it, which is a very liberal moral foundations, to reference John Haidt, who I draw from heavily on the moral foundation stuff. He was very influential for me. You're basically selling, you deserve more. You deserve something cheaper than what you're getting. I will redistribute the profits that this guy would have made, this landlord, by forcing his prices lower. That's less money for him. That is a tax on him. And I will send it to you by making the price lower. That's a gift to you. That is basically selling a handout or welfare under a different name. That's all that is. It's not a price control. Look, we're going to analyze housing districts or whatever. It's like, that is such a waste of time. I just want to, again, roll my eyes and like, one, the answer is obvious. And two, that doesn't matter at all. Like J.D. Vance wrote a little snippet about like childcare costs and stuff. It's like, well, if you regulate this, then there's less of it. And then the price and whatever, it's like giving this economic explanation. I'm like, dude, none of your constituents, almost none, care about that. They care about, is childcare a good thing? Does it help poor people? Yes. Is that worth subsidizing and redistributing resources to? Yes. And is that worth protecting with regulations? Yes. That's what's being sold.
Yeah.
Sounds good to me. Again, what are they voting on? You don't have like this upper echelon of intellectual voting on all this stuff. You have a very common basic, watches the 53rd season of Survivor on CBS type of normie that just like, oh yeah, I like that. That is literally the degree of like thought that's going into this stuff. And that's what sells. And that's why price controls do work. They absolutely work if you're a politician. They get you elected. And then what they do is they make a problem. And the best way to campaign on fixing a problem is to create a problem that can't be attributed to you. And now there's more justification for you to fix the problem that you made and you're contributing to. But you have something you can point to where the attribution is too vague. You can't fully attribute it to you, where it's plausibly deniable, whatever. People just lie anyway in politics. It doesn't matter. But they're selling a moral foundation based off, again, redistribution to a lower agency demographic, which you need to win if you want to win in a democracy. And if you're rich enough to do it, you do it. You can't get away with this if you're not rich. But if you're prosperous, you can do it. And you just see it with the budget spending over time. Transfer payments of like 4x since like the 90s. The highest growth, like per capita income for those have like grown at 3 times the rate of like regular income. It's a massive, massive thing. The government is by far the biggest employer in the U.S. government. It's like 3 times bigger than Walmart, something like that. I forget the number off the top of my head. It's substantially bigger. And yeah, man, like that is not a doge it away thing. Like that's a structural problem with a lot of stuff that is part of the game theory of democracies when, based off the environment, so yeah, that's the right view. When you're assessing if a policy works, really look at the motivation for putting that policy out there. And then you can correctly ascertain if it works or doesn't work.
Yeah, and I think the kind of the subtleness in this argument, and I think a lot of people, even on the right, miss this, is the idea that it's not even like, okay, each party has their client classes, and you promise them money, and the money that they get is why they vote for you. It's actually not even that. It's just the promising of the morally salient good thing
Yeah.
is enough. And even if it gets worse, the fact that you're the guy who is, the childcare guy or the, veteran guy or, I care about good thing. I will do good things for good thing,
Yeah.
in the most, dumbass way, whatever. But, maybe understandable way, like, price fixing, or I'm anti-price gouging, like the whole Uber conversation.
Capital gains taxes, right?
Exactly.
Unrealized capital.
gain.
Unrealized
Yes.
capital gains tax. Yeah,
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. When I heard that, I was like, no, that must be a joke.
Yeah,
But
man.
apparently, well, you guys got lucky this time. I don't know if that would have been possible in any way. I mean, that really sounds like a absurd pie in the sky thing, even for the left.
I think they know that. Like, I think some of these things, are just intense signaling mechanisms, like for certain special interests. And then once you get in, again, once you get elected, and politicians don't do half of the stuff they promise. Trump doesn't do a lot of the stuff he says, maybe because he can or can't, like referencing his last term. So it's like some of the more extreme stuff is like just an intense form of signaling. I feel that no one really expects you to do because the backlash would just be so strong or just so unfeasible. But the point of that is not the nominal policy. The point of that is to really signal fairness harm or care harm, fairness cheating. I'm doing stuff that really focuses on this moral foundation. And for the half of the population that's, we'll say, has a more feminine moral genotype, which is focused on redistribution and care harm and the more feminine moral foundations, that sells to them. And then if you have a comfortable environment, the environment dictates the expression of which political phenotype is ascendant and which political phenotype dominates the culture. I call this hypermoralization and the Bio Foundationalism essays. You see it permeate things like even like Disney movies or ads at the mall, or you see everything touching on like the liberal saturation of all this like stuff that's like, why are they, why is that in this form of media? Well, it's a hyper moralized environment along these verticals explicitly because you're so goddamn rich and comfortable. That's like all you care about is the easy stuff or the stuff that's comfortable and sounds good. And I don't think you fix that unless you add some friction, which means, things have to get hard. And I do think you're seeing things start to get a little harder. You're seeing that with with some of the middle class populist voting you're seeing, because wages have not like grown much at all since like the 70s. Like people are getting poor on like certain terms, and I think they're starting to feel that. And as that starts to be felt, conservatism will rise again because it has to. And I think that's how you do it, not by like writing based essays or stuff like that. Like the underlying environment has to change. It can't be winter anymore to grow your sunflowers.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what do you make of this idea? I think a lot of people, read Francis Fukuyama, they read the title of the thing, they say this guy's an idiot, and they stop. But essentially, I think one of the kind of the deeper points of the end of history is this idea that it's actually more of a hope. It's actually more of a wish casting. The idea that okay, if we can make this thing stable, and and the idea of kind of globalization and bringing growth international and having things
Mm,
continuously grow from kind of the limited contained national vehicles to
mm.
something a bit larger that's actually kind of a flywheel and can maintain this continuous growth, that
Right,
can,
right.
we can run out of this pattern of history where you kind of have these boom bust cycles of feminine and male morality.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
do you think it could be possible? Is there such a thing as continuous growth, especially now given that you have these relatively open-ended technologies, like if nuclear was actually exploited to its actual capacity.
Mm.
AI is a very open-ended technology. There are certain things that have appeared in the landscape, these kind of post-Malthusian things that potentially could lift us into a real post-scarcity environment.
Yeah, and like a phrase, a little line I want to drop into on like the moral foundations and their utility. Like one of the essays I wrote on Twitter that'll go on the blog soon. It's called "Masculine because you have to, feminine because you get to." And like these hard things are things you do because you have to do. And the masculine moral foundations fundamentally are born out of necessity, and the feminine ones are born out of comfort. But you want that. Like, what do you never want that? Do you never want some degree of that expression? That would be its own failure.
Yeah.
Like
Just
so
dying in trenches. That's all we
yeah,
want to do.
exactly. But it's super big. It's like hardcore. Like, yeah, but it's like, does anyone want this? Like, you want some degree of feminine influence and like feminine distribution and moral emphasis. So it's like, you should want women to exert their selection effects and their hypergamy. And, some kind of like first wave feminism is healthy. Like the worst societies are the ones where like women have like no say and they're completely ostracized or like, put in a shack. Like those are not good. Like no one wants to live in those places.
Yeah, because those societies, just as a parenthesis, have essentially decided that the male baseline, kind of uncontrolled male sexual drive, is the baseline, and
Yeah.
then all of society has to bend around that. Obviously, all the women, and then all of it. And the problem is, absolutely unconstrained male sexuality detracts from everything else that
Yeah.
men
Yeah.
should be doing. So that's
Yeah, yeah.
why they are
It's bad for
shitholes.
us. Not only is it dysgenic because it removes like the female selection effects, but it also like it removes the men do some of their best work in service of like gaining a woman's eye and winning the girl and like impressing women. Like we do this fundamentally for family and for women. Like a lot of the work and toil we do. Like and it's just encoded in us to do that. So it's like when you don't have to earn that, that is not good. Like that fosters like an abusive, I hate the word patriarchal because it's so overused, but in that sense, that would be like malignant, toxic patriarchal kind of influence where it's using violence to just do whatever you want, which men have a monopoly over, and that nothing about that. I think it's manifesting dysgenic just on its own. But then it's also just a shitty way to exist. And it's not good for men too. It's not only is not good for women, it's also not good for men. It doesn't bring the best out of them. And so to go back to your question on the globalism thing, so like the post scarcity stuff, or can you grow your way out of it? I'd say one, like how do you conceptualize growth as a GDP number, as like something's going up? There's a running joke that the U.S. is a spreadsheet economy because doesn't like make stuff much here anymore, which is kind of true. Um, but I'd also say like you're growing, but are people better off for that? As collectively, do people have more buying power? Can they consume more? Can they have anything in most measurable ways besides like, the iPhones are cheaper in nominal terms, but are they cheaper in are they cheaper in absolute terms, but are they cheaper in comparative terms or purchasing power parity terms? Um, the middle class is not getting richer. And the middle class is the majority of your society. So it's like your growth needs to do something positive. not just make the reported metrics that go out every quarter, make everyone at the administration pat themselves in the back. All right, we made the number go up. It's like then that number needs to be in service of something. Otherwise, it's a meaningless number. And I would say a lot of the neoliberal globalist type stuff is fundamentally a false promise against scarcity. Where you're like, post scarcity economics, like that's a promise against natural law. That's a promise that there is no that scarcity is what drives economic behavior and activity. And to say there's no scarcity is to say that almost something is not valuable, almost paradoxically, because there's just an abundance of it. And the cascading issues and things beyond that. One, I just think it's a fake environment. Like it can only exist in a digital way. We're not digital beings. So, we don't exist on chain. We don't exist on the internet. So it's like in some ways, yeah, a spreadsheet economy can grow forever, but a real one cannot. I say in that essay too, like a tree cannot grow to the heavens. And if it does, it's not a tree. Like we're talking about something else at that point. A star cannot expand forever. It implodes on itself eventually. Like these things can't grow forever. So what you're doing with like a lot of this globalist stuff is basically just a simple way to expand your labor pool. So corporations get cheaper labor inputs. Like it's very sensible on a nominal way why they do that. I'm not faulting them for doing that. They should do that. I never fault anybody for acting in their self-interest. That's fine. Corporations should act in their self-interest to get the cheapest inputs they can, to make the biggest gross margins they can, to make the best profits they can do. That's what they're designed to do. That's how a complex adaptive system of resource distribution, a micro one, should work within a macro one. But it's like viewing that as like the only thing on a human level that you value. One, that's missing a big, big thing. It's only viewing like the value as like this trinket production, this trinket maximalism. And what it does too to the labor inputs is it crushes them. You're seeing a lot of the immigration into first world countries, like the deficit countries, the countries that are not competitive on labor, are seeing a lot of that. It's not really that surprising. You're seeing some of it like in Germany too, and they're not a deficit country. But that's a way to compete on labor. Pushes prices down. Guys like Bernie Sanders used to be very opposed to that, unsurprisingly so, because he's a labor guy. He's a union guy. They should have some strength. There should be, somewhat fair labor rights. Because if you don't have that, then you have a complete asymmetry on where the power lies. And you have a complete, exploitation of like one side versus the other. You should never want that. You should always want some degree of rough parity on stuff, because if you don't, it manifests an extreme. And the extreme we have right now is like hyper corporatism with the globalism. They outsource their supply chains globally because it's cheaper. And because these surplus countries like China subsidize that, and they underpay their workers fundamentally. And, when I say underpay, I mean as a percentage of your production. So like the average Chinese worker is about 15% as productive as the average US worker. So if they were making 15% of the US wages, that's fine. That's still being competitive. That's a competitive, but it's not. They're 10%. That's a competitive advantage. That's exploiting the production that they're doing, not letting the worker absorb that, because you're getting paid less to your production. And so, because now you're paying a worker less domestically, because now you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot, because you're making your exports more competitive, because you can make them cheaper now. But you have a poor base of labor, meaning they can't buy as much. And the poor people are the ones who buy shit. Rich people don't spend a lot of their money. Poor people do. Middle-class people do. You've driven their wages down a bit. So now you have a demand problem. So what do you do with your demand? You export it overseas to the United States. You dump your cheap shit on them. You dump your cheap shit on the UK, because you don't have that demand domestically. It's exporting demand fundamentally. And we have to buy that by way of debt. And we have to run a current account deficit to do that just mathematically. Which isn't by itself this like harrowing, terrible, awful thing that people freak out about. When it's too far, yeah, it gets bad. But on its face, it's not terrible. But like the way the U.S. is running it is pretty intense, and we need to do it to consume basically this insufficient demand like Germany or China has domestically. Germany also suffers from this too. Like their workers do not get paid proportionate to their productivity. That's why they're so competitive. Why do you think they're so competitive? Because the labor inputs are cheaper. So companies go to where the labor inputs are subsidized, because a lot of Chinese like labor policies too are very anti-union, like South Korea too, like it's illegal to do certain things. Like a lot of the exporting countries have very intense laws on that, I've come to find recently. So it keeps that down. And then you have to ship that demand you're not getting somewhere else, and you dump it on us. And when you do that, there's a price we pay for that, because our manufacturing sector basically subsidizes the domestic consumption. And by that, I mean we don't have a manufacturing sector anymore. It's gone. Like it's mostly gone. It's been sent overseas because it's cheaper over there. So globalism is just a very simple way of making your labor inputs, of expanding your labor inputs because it helps corporate bottom lines. It is not a form of revealed preference for anyone except businesses, and a very near-term focus on, yeah, people want cheaper prices, but I mean, at what cost though? And they want more consumption and purchasing power. When you gut a middle class and gut like wage growth, you do not have more purchasing power. That has not happened. So like you're looking at this, like I see like some little snide, teapot comments and like, oh, you want to pay more for your this? Well, it's like you're fine paying more if the wage growth is disproportionate to that, but you can't have that when you dump a labor input into a country. It just won't work. So it's like only viewing one side of a balance sheet. It completely misses the other side. There's a lot there. I'll
No, no,
stop there. But I hope it
I
made
think
sense. If
you're
anything
right.
didn't, let me know.
No, I think you're right. I think the timeline of executing on this is very tricky. I think because something like um, inflation acts quite quickly if you like slap a tariff on things.
Yeah.
Prices will rise instantly. Reshoring manufacturing, a very slow burn. It's a couple
Yeah.
of cycles of Trump, not Trump, whoever it is, overlapping with like the political process that exists now. I think it's just a very slow burn type of
It's a very low time preference way to view things, and we don't work that way.
yeah.
Democratic elections do not work with low time preference promises. They work with, what can you give me today? And that's not fun. So it's a tax on the consumer. Yes and no. That's such a, when you see something reduced to like such a superficial one line description, you almost know immediately you're dealing with like a politicized comment immediately. And economics is just a proxy for your political beliefs, like bar none. They correlate like 1-to-1. So if you tell me your economic beliefs, I'm like, all right, well, I know what you think politically now. And if I know what you think politically, I know what you think morally. And if I know what you think morally, I know that comes from your temperament. So it's just a biological expression on the money side. So it's just a value judgment. And people are skewing the narrative towards the value they like. They curate the facts they want to curate. And based off the curation of these facts, tariffs are always bad. You can curate another set of facts just fine to show that tariffs will reshore a lot of things, fund you in another way. The US did it that way for a very long time. And would you say the US's power comes from its financial sector or from its manufacturing center historically? What made the US more powerful? Having the dollar be this tool that we can use for dollar diplomacy and have the Schelling point for commerce, or was it our manufacturing? How did the US become the greatness it was?
Yeah, manufacturing
It's very
first.
clearly one way. So it's like, it's just narrative propagation.
Yeah, I think it's promising, but yeah, I think my only constraint is that it's just will take a lot of time, and people will feel the burn of high prices in the beginning, and I think that kind of affected the Biden presidency as well. I mean, we feel inflation here as well when it's tied to other issues, but also pretty much the same, like COVID spending, things that just energy prices were absolutely huge here. I guess in the U.S. as well, but maybe less so because we're straight on the Eastern European. We also had issues with Germany. Germany was an absolute disaster, absolute basket case in terms of energy. So yeah, there's all sorts of little things like that were quite disastrous all over
it's
Europe.
very hard to sell that in a democratic setup. You have to be China to kind of do that, where it's like, I don't need to get elected. I just kind of do what makes
trade
sense.
policy and plan.
And
Trade policy.
everyone has a trade policy too. I just want to like emphasize that too. This is something a guy called Michael Pettis has really helped solidify for me. I don't have a lot of respect for many economists, but he's very good. Everyone has a trade policy. Everyone. If you don't have a trade policy, you have the trade policy of the other guy. Because if you have a domestic policy on like how you treat wages or how you treat stuff, that invariably impacts trade. And unless two parties have the same policies, you have their policy being imposed on you if you don't have a trade policy. So we have China's imposed trade policy because they have one. We're getting more of one, but it's like you never get away from that. You always have that. You just have an explicit one or an implicit one. And stuff like, the free trade guys, which is not something you can argue against. Free trade is clearly good on a comparative advantage basis, but comparative advantage is only expressed in the exchange of goods, not in just the creation of them. If I create a bunch of stuff locally and don't export it, that's not an advantage. That's not the classic advantage of free trade. And there's a huge balance of payments mismatch, which means you are not getting that comparative advantage going. So you're not getting those free trade benefits. That's not a thing. You're just getting stuff dumped on you, and one side hoarding resources that, to use in other ways. You're not getting a free trade dynamic. It's just a platitude that doesn't apply to our situation, because that only applies in the relative exchange of goods and when both parties are respecting it. Both parties are not respecting it right now.
Exactly, and comparable legal regimes. I mean, China is a completely different, it's almost like an alien planet in terms of, what's allowed, in terms of the constraints put on businesses, what exactly a business is in terms of its relation to the government, what exactly a government is in its relation to the people and businesses. It's just,
Yeah,
it's just like trading with aliens and then
yeah,
expecting Ricardian, dynamics to kick in. Yeah,
exactly.
it's
Yeah.
really tough. I know we're slowly coming up on time, so I want to ask you the question of the show. The last question, everyone gets this. Do you have someone that you recommend? I mean, you mentioned a few people in this chat, but maybe someone who's been influential in your worldview that you think people should check out.
Um. Hmm. Yeah, I'll give like a non-political answer. Most of them are not political for me. I don't read like a ton of political writers. Roy Sutherland is excellent. Do you know who he is?
Rory Sutherland, the ad guy, no, from
Yes,
the
yeah, he's
UK.
a marketing. He's a
Yeah.
marketing's just, I feel, just such a disservice for him though.
Hmm.
Like he's an incredibly creative, thoughtful dude who just I resonate with him a lot because he just has this inverted way to view a lot of stuff that I feel like a kindredness to. So he's awesome. Who else do I really like? I read all the time. Oh, Bern Hobart on the financial side.
Hmm.
He's excellent. He's a mutual of mine on Twitter. Really, really cool guy. And yeah, he's just, I would almost call him like a capital philosopher. Like saying again, he writes about finance, I think is a disservice for him. He recalibrates stuff in just a very interesting, functional way that's digestible to, like, if you have a basic level of finance and a chat GPT at your disposal, like you can absorb what he's saying. And it's an interesting way to frame a lot of stuff. So those two guys are really cool on the creative side and the financial side.
Yeah, and I want to say I think that's what attracted me a lot to your work as well. Like you have a very clear and unique way of systematizing things and presenting them, and also kind of a bit of poetic, twang to it as well. Like I really enjoy your essays, and you also have written quite a lot. I can't believe I discovered you like maybe a couple months ago, but I see you have quite a bit of backlog. It took me a while to kind of go through it. I was like, there's more. Wow, that's incredible. So the fact that I didn't, come across you earlier is quite shocking to me because I've spent so much time on the internet. But yeah, no, it's really good. I really want people to check out your work on Substack. I'll put it in the show notes. Is there any other place where you work? I know you're on Twitter, but yeah, if you could plug
Yeah.
whatever you'd like.
Yeah, yes. I haven't been doing it that long, like only really about a year and maybe 4 or 5 months ago. So, but yeah, I've been very like super productive. Like, you know, I don't know, like in a certain phase where it's just producing a lot. Yeah, Substack. My blog is called The Essence of a Thing, and on Twitter, my handle is Back the Bunny, based off of some past work I did. So the handle's a little funny. I know I don't have a thing for bunnies. It's just the name. So yeah, I'm on Twitter there. I'm very active on Twitter, and I've been much more active on Substack within probably like the last 4 months or so, where like I'm cross posting on the notes and the tweets. So yeah, I'm there all the time. I really enjoy it. It's really cathartic for me. It's led me to meet like a ton of awesome people, talking to people like you. I was in El Salvador a couple months ago. I was in LA for an election party with, some very, political, Curtis was there and like some others. So it's like, it's got me to like meeting my people, so to speak. So I really value it from that lens, and I'm going to keep doing it just because the valence of it is awesome. So yeah, I'm active there, and I am also building a lot of stuff in the DeFi/crypto space. It is not, if you don't come from that space and you hear those words and you are turned off by those words, that's fine. You're almost probably justified. But like, you should glean a little bit from what you just heard about me about what I do in this space, and it's not like a gimmicky, gamey type stuff. It's actually something more substantial I'm working on right now. So if you have any interest in DeFi, crypto writ large, I'm very financially versed, and especially in the crypto vein and just in the finance vein in general. Reach out to me. Any questions about anything at all, or you want to talk? I'm always open.
I see.
Project's
I
called
mean,
Salutary.
salutary. Okay, perfect.
Hmm.
I actually might take you up on that because I mean I'm not a complete stranger to DeFi, but the more conversation goes into that direction, I do tend to have my eyes glaze over a little bit because
Yeah,
it
yeah,
gets a
fairly
little bit
so.
complex
A
a little
lot of
bit.
my like audience, like where I initially started, was in the crypto space. So like I am, and my framing of that, this is what I talked about in El Salvador with like, and there are at El Salvador administration members there, like Bukele's. It's viewing it from the lens of like the fourth industrial revolution and its relationship with like the state and financial infrastructure. So yeah, if you want to do another convo just on that, like
Yeah,
it's not in
absolutely.
the yeah, it's not in the way that probably anyone has experienced it. I've never seen anyone articulate it the way that I do, and it's got a pretty good audience in the crypto in like the actual crypto space. It's unique even to crypto native audiences. So I imagine like a political audience would also find it fresh.
Okay, perfect, perfect. Will do, will do. Thank you so much, Dmitry. This is really enjoyable, and yes, we will do this again very soon on crypto.
Yep. All right. Thanks, Alex. I appreciate you reaching out.
If you've enjoyed this conversation, please do like, subscribe, do any sort of positive interaction that the platform that you're listening on encourages. And please do go to alexkashuta.com to become a paid subscriber, to be part of the community, to have access to the full archive of every episode that has ever been recorded of this podcast, or to patreon.com/Subversive to support me. Thank you so much if you do. And I encourage you, if not, Christmas is coming up, Thanksgiving, whatever holiday you think is a good impetus to become a subscriber. I do really appreciate it. And it does help me produce these episodes and get more and more interesting guests like our today's guest, Dmitry, which I found very engaging as a conversation. So thank you so much for being here and see you next week.